little bit?
Yeah. I'm gonna have to get into class. So if you want to go to Whataburger or something and get, we've got frozen dinners up
I'm not
there.
starving, but you later on.
Well,
Okay.
I'm not available
That's fine.
to cook until 8 o'clock.
No, I'm not needing that later.
Right, so. Hey everybody. So tonight we are going to be continuing with volume, but this time it's complex volume. And I've asked that you have 3 light-colored or white objects. It doesn't matter what the objects are made of. I have a set of objects, which is this creamer, sort of vintage, a sugar bowl, and a butter container. So these are good, 3 good objects, 2 that are cylindrical and 1 that is a rounded rectilinear form to study. So that's what I would recommend that you have tonight. And what we're doing is building upon the class where I had you draw the geometric forms, and I used my styrofoam objects to do so with. But this is different tonight because we're actually working with objects that you have in your kitchen that are fabricated. So it's more complicated in terms of that. It's also more complicated in terms of this is a group of objects. Now I did a very small demonstration with three geometric shaped objects when we studied volume, but this is even more complex. And I have a white napkin that I'm going to put beneath my still life, and I'm going to fold it up a little bit so that as I draw tonight we can talk a little bit about value and working with a undulating fabric surface to depict value. So I would recommend that you do the same, that you have a white or light colored placemat or pillowcase, something underneath your still life tonight that you can kind of make some folds in so that we can practice doing some value studies. And for that reason, I would prefer that you work in charcoal, in the vine charcoal, for us to study value. But if you want to use graphite, that's okay too. Okay, so I'm going to. If I can hold that under the camera later. But I'm going to go ahead and go to our handout for tonight. Let me take roll. Okay, let's see. So looks like I just have Fang Ling and Jalen tonight. Okay, you should be seeing. Is that sharing? Are you seeing the handout? Complex volumetric form? Okay. Alright. Yeah, I didn't finish. Okay. There we go. Okay, you should be seeing it. You should be seeing it now. So we are setting up a still life, and we've been doing some still lifes earlier in our term together with natural objects, but this is the most complicated arrangement of objects we've done yet. So you should have an arrangement of several objects. The composition is an arrangement of elements of the artwork that unites the elements into one whole. So pay careful attention to the object placement inside the drawing from the beginning. Start with a loose organizational line drawing. And tonight, let's just go ahead and center it in the page. That's fine. Tomorrow night, not tomorrow night, but the last class, I'll talk more about placement on the page. But tonight, you don't have to worry so much about composition. There must be a balance between the drawn objects and the space around them. So you're going to show the whole still life, and you can use gestural line to first sketch it. The drawn object should not be too small. That's usually what I encounter with beginning drawing students. They tend to draw very small or too big, so that they fall off from the paper, or they need to be shifted to the left or the right. So this is the first stage of drawing the still life. The next important part is the proportions of the objects. The proportion is the interrelation between two or more magnitudes, like length versus width. Notice the relations between the sizes of the shapes. And you can use your pencil as an alignment stick to get accurate measurements of the height and width of the various objects. Notice that a bowl is actually a half sphere. A jug is a combination of a sphere and cones or of cylinders. Notice the light and shade of the objects, and also the shades on the table and the wall. While drawing, try to see not only the objects, the positive, but also the spaces around and between the objects, the negative. So that's so we're using all these skills that we've been working on. You know, when I taught you gestural line, that's so you get a quick layout of everything in the still life. When we studied negative shape, seeing that space between the shapes. When we studied volume, how to depict planes. When we studied value, how to depict light hitting the objects. All of that factors in now. So next class, I'll talk more about a cropped or enlarged still life, making a viewfinder, and also we'll talk about surfaces and what different surfaces do. This is organizational line, and organizational line can help you in lining up the objects based upon their scale, and that means comparing one object to another object, versus proportion is comparing part of an object to the whole of the object. Okay, there's two artists that we can talk about with volume. Cézanne, the father of modern art, and I believe I've already mentioned him with some of my other handouts. Like perspective, he was the one that threw linear perspective out the window. But he's mentioned more in my volume handout, where everything comes down to the cube, the cone, the sphere. Giorgio Morandi was an Italian artist, mid-20th century, and he deliberately limited his choice of still life objects to the unremarkable bottles, boxes, jars, jugs, and vases that were commonly found in his everyday domestic environment. He He would then depersonalize these objects by removing their labels and painting them with a flat matte color to eliminate any lettering or reflections. In this condition, they provided him with an anonymous cast of ready-made forms that he could arrange and rearrange to explore their abstract qualities and relationships. So this is Morandi on the right. Some art historians believe that his still life arrangements were actually portraits of this little Italian village, and he never left that village. He stayed there his whole life. I think that he was most interested in studying light and how light interacts with the world. So you can see his palette was very muted, more using tones, which are colors that are muted with black, white, or other colors added to them. You know, lots of browns and grays and sort of creamy off-whites. So both these artists are good to reference for this assignment. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our meeting. And I'm going to turn my lights on, lower the camera. And I wanted to show you first the perspective drawing. I loaded it into last week's class. So I finished my perspective drawing, and you both finished yours, and I was happy to see your work with that. So this was my friend in Cologne, Germany, that I did with the mermaid gate, and I used graphite to finish that perspective drawing, and I loaded the some details like how I handled the bricks, how I handled the figure, and you can see also, as well as a use of linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, because the darkest areas now, the most contrast, are in the foreground, especially that gate. And then it gets grayer as you go to the middle ground, and then the background has the least amount of contrast. So that's atmospheric perspective. I'm going to show you some examples a couple of examples of simple volumes. So this is a pretty large drawing, so I have to bend it a little. And this was using willow charcoal. It has that kind of sepia quality. But it was a basket, a wooden, like old-timey basket, and these are some of the supplies we have at Southwest School. So this was a large still life that I set up, and this was an old, like from a hardware store, thick glass container, so it was transparent. And then tumbling out of the baskets were some apples. So this was a good arrangement of objects to study cylindrical form with the basket, spherical form with the apples, and then rectilinear form with this squarish, rectangular-like shaped thick glass. And I actually have a lantern over further to the left. But I did think about my arrangement in terms of diagonals. Like I have a strong diagonal, and that's an implied line. We can talk about line as well in terms of line of vision. Like if you're looking at someone and they're looking at you, there's an implied line between you. So when we are examining composition, there's a diagonal movement here, and then there's another diagonal movement here, and that's really dynamic. Diagonals are the most dynamic of all implied lines, and we'll talk more about that next week. But that's I purposefully did that with this arrangement. And you'll want to think about setting up your still life so your smaller objects are in the front, and you have some your taller objects are in the middle ground or background. So you have to think about how you arrange your objects. I was happy with the value range that I achieved on this in terms of the light quality. Next week I'll show you other examples, some of which are in color, drawings I've done of objects, but you can get a sense for reflectivity in the glass, and it's a much lighter value range. I believe it was clear glass, but it was thick, so it kind of had this kind of pale green to it. But the basket recessing, that's going to be the darkest part of the drawing, because light can't go into the basket. So next week when we do the surfaces, glass is very challenging because it catches reflections off of anything that's around it, and you can see through it. So if you want a real challenge next week, then glass. And glass can be surprisingly dark, unexpectedly dark when you start to really draw it, because it's reflective. So this was another drawing I did, and I was happy with the scale of it, but I was not happy with, I went too dark. So I went too dark, and I'm using both these objects again because I want to challenge myself tonight to get that value range better. I felt that these are white reflective objects, and I want to be more delicate in how I handle the value. And you're going to find that you are going to tend to go too light, or you're going to tend to go too dark. I go too dark with value. I know I do. And so I have to compensate for that. And I use value in a very muscular way in terms of my mark making. Other people use value in a very gentle, soft way. So you'll find out, you'll go on that journey with your own drawings in terms of your personality and how you just naturally work with the mediums. And then, you just find that. You find that way that you handle the medium, and keep developing your skill with it. So, and that'll just come naturally. You'll know. It'll feel right. Okay? I was happy with the little tea. That's a tea ball. I think that worked out. This was a tea container made of wood, and so it had a wood grain. Next week, that's something that you could think about, is looking for objects that show some wood grain, if you're going to work with wood. But these two are ceramic, and they are reflective. Not as reflective as glass, but they're still reflective. Okay, Set my little still life up. And I'll put the camera on it so that you can see the arrangement. So while I'm doing that, why don't you each tell me like what objects you're working with tonight? Okay, Jalen. Well, the glass jars are going to be a challenge. So the jars are going to be reflective, and the cup is not. Styrofoam is not reflective. And then, do you have like something under it, like a napkin or something? Okay, good. So I'll show you my still life, and you can see how I arrange the fabric around it. Get it so you can see it. There we go. Okay, so that's going to be my arrangement, and lower it a little so you can see how I've placed the napkin underneath it. Put a little more of a, that's good. So not too many folds or it'll be too difficult. There. So you should see some like value range, like here where the fabric, the top of it catches the light, and then as it turns away from the light it becomes grayer, and then when it gets into a crevice it gets the darkest, and that's why fabric is so good for practicing change in value from dark to light. So I have the butter container in the front because it's the lowest of all my objects. And then the creamer's a little higher. They're both cylindrical, but it's a nice set, I think, to work with in terms of 3 objects. And it also gives me the opportunity to work with one object that has a lid and one object that's open. Both you have to depict the ellipse of the opening, but there's different considerations with both. This gives you a convex surface versus concave, and then this is you end up depicting the interior of the creamer. And this gives a rectilinear kind of rounded form. So it's kind of a cross between a rectilinear form and a cylinder. Fang Ling, what are you working with tonight? Okay. No, it doesn't matter tonight. Just light colored so that you can easily see the value range. Sure. Yeah, next week is when we're gonna focus more on surface quality. vine charcoal is made from burnt grapevines. Except our willow, though, which is similar in consistency to vine, is made from willow trees. And the sepia is worn. Maybe I'll work with some willow tonight so you can see it. Compressed charcoal is dark, very dark, and it's burnt wood. I like the smokiness of vine charcoal, but it's delicate. So this is willow. This is willow charcoal. Here, use that time. I can show you just scratch this paper. So willow, it's like that. That's, you know what, I don't like it on that. Sheet. This is good. Actually, I think I have a sheet that I did, but it's already got it laid out. Okay, here it is. Okay. So this was a sample of mine for depicting fabric. That's charcoal. Willow. I drew that with willow. So this shows the value chart that I asked you all to make out of graphite, going from 1 to 10. 1 is black, 10 is white, but graphite is never black. Graphite is silvery, but it's the best to make a value chart in. Okay, so I would do that if you haven't. So this shows with graphite blending in order to create continuous tone going from dark to light, and you do that by holding the edge of the pencil and moving it side to side. It's better to do this kind of work on drawing paper because drawing paper, unlike sketchbook paper, has tooth that grabs the drawn material. This is willow charcoal, which is a soft sepia, warm tonality. vine charcoal is this one, and it's cooler. It's cooler in tone than the willow. So this is made from grapevine, this is made from willow trees. And then here is compressed charcoal. So you can see that it's much darker than either of the willow or the vine. Now you can get different, as I mentioned the first day of class, you can get different gradations of everything, just like you can with the pencils. So medium, hard, soft is usually what that entails. And then if you don't like to work with charcoal because it's messy, I would recommend Conti crayon, but it's more expensive. Okay, did that help? And here's another one that just shows, this was with pen and ink too. I showed hatching and I showed stippling, and I know some of you experimented with those to try them out. So hatching is with lines, stippling is with dots. And then this shows in a broader sense charcoal in terms of creating value or continuous tone. This shows charcoal, graphite, and ink wash. Okay, and you have to add water to the ink, whether it's India ink or Sumi ink, to get that gray tonalities. And that's challenging to do. Okay. Yeah, that's really a misnomer, because nothing white can be charcoal. Charcoal, the essence of charcoal is that it's burnt. So charcoal is always going to be black. So they call it white charcoal, I know. It's manufacturers misnaming things. But it's a pastel. And white probably is made from chalk, calcium carbonate, which is a natural sedimentary rock. And the other, thing, and next week, that's going to be an option for you to have pastels. In fact, a black pastel can be very dark. See, these are different pencils that in a pastel stick that have pigments added to them. Most pigments now are synthetic. They're cooked in a lab by the art supply companies. But traditionally, like sienna brown, like this, even though it says chocolate, this Derwent pencil. Well, actually, that's dark. Sienna brown's more like this. That came from soil around the Italian city of Siena, and I've been to Siena, and the soil is reddish. It has a lot of iron in it, so it's kind of a warm reddish brown. Whereas burnt umber, which is named for another city in Italy, or the Umbria region, is a dark brown. But so from minerals, usually minerals are what give pigments their color, but in some cases it's plants, especially with dyes, and even animals. Like there's the cochineal beetle. They live here in San Antonio on prickly pears, and that white webbing you see on the cacti. If you pinch it, you'll have red stuff squirt all over your hand from the animal. And in South America, they use that as a dye for wool. So these are all pastels. They have a pastel core. I have some white. I have some white charcoal. somewhere. And I have, here's the white charcoal. And I have, yeah, this is white charcoal, which is a pastel. So next week you could use this. But you can get Conti crayon. It's Conti. And Conti comes sanguine, or burnt sienna, black, and white. And it's more expensive than charcoal, but it's a lot less messy. It's a very fine drawing material. Okay. So you can start with pencil to do a sketch, and we'll do some organizational line with this too. So you can think about your objects. If you want, you can just draw like the basic shapes of your objects, like the butter container is a rectangle. You can just do very simple shapes to start with. The sugar container is a cylinder. So now we're having to deal with objects that have a relationship. They're next to each other, they're interacting with each other. Now I taught you about using the alignment stick, okay? And that's where you take a pencil, preferably one that has writing on it, and I hold it like this using my thumb to move up and down the pencil when I need to measure objects. Okay, so I can hold, I'm going to move the camera so that you can see me holding this up to my still life. And by the way, that's how I store my drawing supplies. That's a nice container with separators. I recommend that for your art supplies. I got that at like Big Lots, I think, or something. So sometimes things like that are better to get at places that are not art supply stores. They'll be cheaper, and they might even be better made. So when you're using the alignment stick and you're looking at your objects, and your distance from the objects must stay the same as you work on the drawing. So if you don't finish your drawing or painting, whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that when you go back to it that you have the same amount of distance between you and the objects. Okay, so I can hold my alignment stick up and I can measure. I usually close my right eye and look out of my left eye when I do this. But like, let's say I'm trying to figure out the scale of my objects. And scale is about comparing objects. So if I I have to back up away from the camera as I do this. But if I measure, like from the top here to that line, and how many of these make a creamer? Now, these are very short objects. If I had something like a big vase behind me, it might be 3 butter containers. Make 3 butter trays in terms of height. Make the height of a vase. But for this, it won't be. It'll be something like 1.5 butter containers. Okay, so if I look from here. And right now I'm using my alignment stick to look from the top of my butter container to this line, and I have this, my finger stops right here on this A. So it helps me if there's lettering on my alignment stick to line my thumb up. Now I can't see the bottom of the creamer because the butter tray is blocking it. You can kind of lean over and see where the bottom of your, but you can kind of guess looking at where the bottom of it is. So, and I'm going to measure like from here to the bottom of my butter container, or the bottom of here to the bottom of my creamer. It's about the same height, and I know you're like, well, that can't be. And do not get a ruler and measure. That won't help you. That's exact measurements, and I'm teaching you to measure with your eye, to observe carefully and measure that way. And this is called sighting. So it definitely deals with the eye. And I just noticed I've got a handle on the back here. I'm going to turn that so that that'll be more challenging to see the handle. I could actually do it like that. I think I like that, so that I see that handle clearly. That's better. And I get more diagonal movement with the creamer facing that way anyway. And it casts a shadow onto the sugar bowl, which will be another challenge. So you're like, well, obviously this is not the same height as this. However, this is further back in space. It's at a higher ground plane. We talked about this when we discussed linear perspective last week, and volume. As things go back in space, they're at a higher ground plane. So because it's at a higher ground plane, then yeah, it actually is the same height as the butter container, because I'm going to show it at a higher level. It'll be implied because you won't see the bottom of the creamer. Now the creamer and the sugar bowl are at the same, at the same ground plane in the back. If I move this further back, that would be different. Okay, or if I moved it off to the side closer to the butter container, that would change it. But right now, like that, they're in the same ground plane. Okay, you could draw a line, like a horizontal line in your still life. Like this is the foreground, the butter tray is on that line. These objects are further back. They're on a line that's here. So there's this line, and then there's this line. This is the foreground, this is the middle ground. We don't really have a background for this. Okay, so if I measure from like here, and I know in the camera you can't see it, but I can see this bottom edge of the sugar bowl. If I measure from here, I mean, you could measure from here to, I'm just going to measure to here, that line. And I like the lines on these. That's helpful. And I look at how tall that is. I'm right at like A on my stick here. I know it's a little blurry, but that's an A. Okay, and then I look over at my creamer, and it's about measuring from the bottom of the creamer to the top. You know, this is about a third shorter. A third, it's smaller than this, and that just helps me figure out scale. And I can also, the lines help too. Pay attention to where like that intersects the creamer. And when you're drawing, try to line those up. So you want to look at where does the butter container cross the sugar bowl. And actually I have this line helps me see that. Okay, and you can hold you don't have to just hold the alignment stick vertically. You can also hold it horizontally, and that helps you see exactly where those intersections happen between the objects. So it's just a really useful way of figuring out scale. Now let's talk about proportion. Proportion is how do the dimensions relate to the whole. So let's say I drew this sugar bowl, and it looked too slender. Well, the problem is that I need more width. I need it to be more squat. Okay? Or let's say I drew the creamer, and it had the opposite problem. It looked low to the ground. Well, I need to increase the height. That's proportion. So you have two factors you have to get accurately done: the proportion of the individual objects, and then the scale of all the different objects relative to each other. And like when you, like this, and I know in the camera you can't see it. Here, let me turn that light. That's better. There's negative space here, and that negative space has a shape. Pay attention to that shape. Handles, drawing handles, the negative shape can really help you do it accurately, and handles are hard. Students have a lot of trouble with handles. Okay? Do you understand how to use the alignment stick? Does it make sense? Okay, excellent. All right, back to my drawing. All right, so, and you know, the lighting is better now. It was too harsh, so make sure your lighting is good for showing your objects in the best way. So that creamer is a cylindrical object. And I'm making this pretty small. Let me decrease the exposure. That might be too much. That was a big jump. We need more light than that. Okay, that's good. Sorry, my blinds seem to be casting. You know what, I'm going to... I like the lighting. I know the mini blinds are casting a shadow. So I can fix this so it might not make it worse. Okay, I think that's good. But I wanted to leave room for the fabric. Change my fabric a little. And I'll just do a little bit with the fabric, show a few lines with the fabric, very basic lines. Okay. That's good. Alright, now I've got the basic objects laid out. And working in charcoal, I would have like something that you can put your hand on because it's going to smear. And before I start adding value, I want to get my objects drawn a little more with pencil. Because right now they don't really look like objects, they're more geometric shapes. Okay, so, and I want to check my proportion and my scale. Well, I know the butter container's got to be higher. So remember that, like, looking at the butter container, I'm also thinking about like the rectilinear forms, the cubes that I had you draw. And like I've got fabric folding over the butter container, but I'm going to ignore that right now and just kind of make the fabric transparent so that I can see all sides of the butter container, the butter tray, I should say. So keep in mind what the basic shapes are of these objects. And that'll help you be accurate. Okay, so this is a cylinder, my sugar container, and it's the one with the lid. And what did I tell you about objects that are circular on the top? What kind of shape does that make? Yes, Jalen, or an ellipse. It's like a distorted circle. So that's the, but right now you wouldn't know if that's open or if it's closed. Okay, and when I throw a handle on top, it'll be pretty clear. If it's an object that doesn't have a handle, it's going to depend on how you shade it. Is that turning the right way? It's also smaller. So like you may notice, like with things that have lids, like the distance between the lip of the vessel and the lid is very narrow, and then as you see more and more towards the back, it becomes wider. And that's a good way to indicate depth with a circular object. So when you have like a rim of something, it doesn't stay the same width all the way around the object. You can see how I made that more narrow at the front and then wider at the back, and that gives a good feeling for depth. Don't do any details. Like there's a line in the middle of the sugar container, but I'll look at that later. And now that I've drawn the sugar container, I can see that my butter container is the wrong scale. The butter tray is too small. So that's not a problem right now. I can adjust that. That's why you don't want to focus on details. You don't want to use a hard contour line. You need to be able to make changes right now, because now you can without a lot of effort. So I need to make, the height is okay on my, well, it could go up a little higher, just a little bit. So this is when you start troubleshooting and making those kinds of changes. See, I could take my alignment stick and I could go, okay, if I'm looking at my still life, I could measure with my alignment stick the width of the sugar bowl, and then, okay, how many sugar bowls across is my butter tray? Okay, so let me find out. Two and a third. So now I look at my drawing and I go, okay, that's one width of the sugar bowl. One, two, and then just about like right here. So I was like, I first drew my rectangle like right here, so I wasn't wide enough. That looks better. That's a more accurate width. Okay, and that's going to make my, that's going to end up making the creamer taller, or wider, not taller, wider. If you have an object with a spout, spouts can be kind of challenging. So I know the creamer is, and also, that's good. I'm intersecting with that curvature on the butter tray at the right point. when I look at the still life. And I'm going to ignore the handle right now. So when you first draw something like a coffee cup, or like this, that has anything with a handle, just ignore it and just get the sides done. You can worry about the handle later. And plus you don't want to draw something like that when you may have to erase it because you've got to change something about the object. So just get the proportions of the object correct first. And I can look at, I can also measure the width again of my sugar bowl and compare that with the creamer. It's like about 2/3 the width of the creamer. Of the sugar bowl. So it's less width and more height. Those are its proportions. And see how my line quality is very loose, industrial. You can also use organizational line here, or you can use a ruler, and you can draw, there's the top of this object, and do it very lightly, or a dotted line, because you're going to erase it later. Just to look at where your objects are intersecting. And you can pretend objects are transparent, like if you wanted to keep running the line of the creamer down through the butter. But this can help you accurately lay out the objects. It's actually more on a slant, a diagonal, better. Like that. Okay, organizational line. I think the proportions of my creamer, it could be just a tad wider. It's a little too tall. It needs a little bit more width. And I have had some students that sort of defy the physics of the universe. And like with an open vessel, they'll have the concave part stick out over the edge of the vessel. That can't be. It's got to line up. Maybe some other mirror universe that would work, but not in this one. And you'll notice as you draw objects that you really notice them. Drawing is such a mindful activity. You really connect with the object, and you I'm just can look at these vintage tableware pieces. They're so simple, but they're so elegant and functional, and I enjoy looking at them. There can be a lot of pleasure in having everyday objects that are well crafted, well made. I think my tea or coffee always tastes better out of a nice ceramic mug, especially if a friend made it. Okay, I just realized I've got to bring that line up. Now I'm starting to get, I've got my scale, oops, my scale's okay. Although I think the opening on this could be a little, maybe just a little more. When you change one thing, it's going to affect something else, because you're working in a group now. So every change affects another thing. I think that's okay. Okay, so this line should be where that line is in the sugar bowl. Now with an open vessel like this, I don't have a handle like I had over there. So the only way that I can indicate that this is open is I have to do shading. And that'll give a sense for light not being able to go inside of this, because it's going to get darker and darker. But that's later. Also, when you have a vertical object like this, use the edge of your paper as a plumb line, and it can help at some point. We're working small, but it helps to put your paper up and look at it from a distance. If you're working large, like I prefer to draw like with pads on an easel, or those horses like we have in the classrooms, wooden horses. But when you work flat all the time, that distorts. So you got to put it upright at some point and check it out. If we were in a physical classroom, I wouldn't have you working flat on the table. That's why having a drafting table that tilts is a good. That's what I have in my studio, and I have easels too. Oops, sorry. But you can see how I'm jumping around from one object to another. I'm not fixated on one object. Okay, now I'm going to put the handle on, the creamer. And I'm going to pay attention to that negative space. I'm going to draw the negative space, just like I taught you when we did shape. You have to get that negative space right. This is going to be wider. And the sugar bowl. I think this actually comes in a little. Yeah, that looks better. Alright, so I've got my 3 objects laid out. And I want to get some shading done, both on the objects and on the fabric, so that we can talk about value a little bit. So that'll be good. We can see value with a hard object that's reflective, and value with a soft object that's non-reflective. And I'm going to start going from left to right so that I don't smear as much. Although it can be a good idea to put in value like all throughout the drawing, just to stay accurate in terms of your value range. So it's good to draw some of the folds with a pencil, and then you can shade with the pencil, or you can switch to charcoal to start to get your value. So I'm increasing I needed to increase some of the size of the napkin that I'm working with, because I increased the size of the objects. I'm going to work with some of the willow. Charcoal to do this study. And this is white paper, so the white of the paper is going to be my lightest areas. So I'm going to need to lay in the gray tonalities and then the cast shadows, which are the darkest areas. And I really want you to try to stay true to the value that you see in your objects, translating that into the value range of your drawing. It'll help you to squint, to see contrast, and to block color if any of your objects have color, so that you are more focused on contrast, value. How dark is it? How light is it? And where, like with reflective objects, like the ceramic pieces, it can be helpful to go ahead and outline the highlights, so you know you need to leave the white of the paper. Because if you shade the highlighted areas, you can use the kneaded eraser to pull those out, and I can show you about using the kneaded eraser with value, because it can be, especially in tight spaces, it can be really helpful. But you'll never get back to the pristine whiteness of the paper even after you erase it. Rims of objects catch the light if they're reflective, like, and I see these even in the navy blue stripe that is on the lip of these containers. The reflection, the highlight is white. And I'll probably have to, at the very end, take the kneaded eraser and mold it to a point. So once I put in the dark value for the navy edge, see how I can make the kneaded eraser go to a point, and that can really help me get in there and try to pull out the highlight and clean it up. At the very end, your drawing, when you look at all your value range, you want to make your darks darker and make your highlights lighter. That's always how I end a drawing or a painting. Is otherwise, well, I think what I didn't like about that other drawing I did is it just felt like everything was too much the same value. You've got to have contrast to make rich, dynamic imagery. If it's all the same value range, it's just going to lack variety and vitality. So I'm just looking at this, putting in a few places where I'm seeing some highlights. And the highlights can give a sense of dimension to the objects. Like that right there implies that that's a curving surface. can also help to have like a nice soft brush that you use for erasing, that you brush off your eraser pieces with. I wouldn't use it for painting, just use it for doing just that. Okay, so let's get some value in with my charcoal. So I've got, the fabric tends to funnel. It's just in the nature of fabric. So I would recommend you, if you haven't drawn a pillowcase, draw one and study the value. And I'm going to need a stump to work with to do value. Okay, so that's that coiled paper that's pointed on each end, and you can clean it with the sandpaper. Okay, and this is, I need to pull that off. So you can clean it. If you don't have one of these, you can just use a scrap piece of paper. You know, and you might get one for charcoal, one for like compressed, one, you know, these come in all different sizes too. But you can use that for blending. If you recall, I told you that your fingers are best for graphite, but for charcoal, you need something like this for blending. And these points can be very useful to get into tight spaces. Okay, so that's a fold, and it's really recessed, so it's pretty dark. I'm accurate with my value range. Now I have the sugar bowl is casting a shadow here, so and what you find with fabric is just you may lose your place as you're working with fabric, but just be patient. You'll find where you were again. But you just slowly but surely lay in value based upon your observations, and then, like magic, you'll suddenly look at it and it's like, oh my goodness, that looks like fabric. That looks real. Okay, just what I did, just there. Now it's starting to read as fabric. You've got that sense of funneling fabric that's making a fold. It has that telltale curvature of fabric. My handout on value also talks about taking like a white paper bag or just a white piece of paper and crumpling it and drawing that too. Paper makes very different types of creases, more creases than folds, and there, although you can fold paper for sure, origami, but it's very there's sharper contrast. It's not as continuous and gradual as it is with a fabric fold. It has a different look. Okay, so that's just a little bit about using value with to depict fabric. Okay. So now let me just go to, how about in the little bit of time we have left, looking at the sugar bowl, and like I'll draw the rim, and then I'll start to bring out that, using my kneaded eraser, the edge. Now if you're working with charcoal, you're going to have to fix it, like you saw with your volume. So I've told you I like Spectrafix, but you can use Aquanet hairspray, or like a Krylon or 3M spray. So see, like what I want to get in there to get that, bring out that rim. So I take my kneaded eraser, and you can put your finger, your index finger, to kind of brace it, and it can pull out that area to create a highlight. And you can make it thinner and thinner, so you can really get in there. And just keep going back and forth. And then you'll need to go in with, and if you want to, you can use a charcoal pencil. A charcoal pencil can be useful in these situations because that's a lot less surface area. It's a point versus this, which is more of a square. You can also sharpen this, but you could take this with your charcoal pencil and really get in there to create that sense of a highlight. There. And that looks like it's catching the light. So next week, we're going to talk more about composition and working with surfaces. So you want to have objects that have a variety of different surfaces that could be reflective, matte, or have wood grain, something along those lines. So it could have a lot more detail. And another option for next week too is to work using a toned paper, like this paper, that has like a buff, kind of a buff color. And I'm using some brown pencils and white charcoal. So think about, here's another one where I was working on that same kind of buff paper, like a little wine glass and a bowl with nuts. So I may do one of these two next week. And this is a wood cut, probably this one. I think I'll keep working on this one. You can use gray paper. You can use black paper if you want to work on a tone. If you're using like a muted sort of brownish yellow or a brown, any kind of brown paper, you'll want to get a brown pastel I think it's easiest to work in pencil form. So Derwent makes brown pencils, pastel pencils. Now, not waxy color pencils like Prismacolor. You want something that's more like a pastel. So this one is a Derwent. This Derwents are very nice. Jerry's Artorama has these big, thick ones, but they need a special sharpener, or you've got to use an X-Acto knife. Yeah, these are all Derwents. But there's some other brands, I'm sure, that you can get. And yeah, this one's chocolate. This one's sepia that I got. I think I got this at Jerry's Artorama. And you can get white pastels, or you can use the white charcoal. But if you're working on any warm toned papers that are more yellowish and brownish, then you'll want these, and black charcoal works well too. If it's a gray paper, you definitely need white. But charcoal and white look really good on gray paper. If you're working on black paper, you're going to need white, just white. You won't need charcoal. Okay, so you don't have to do that. You can work on white paper with these as well. Well, not the white one, but with the brown ones look really nice on white paper.